When 100 expert mechanics from the most prestigious shops in Los Angeles failed to repair the $200,000 Ferrari belonging to Victoria Ashford, the wealthiest heiress in California, no one could have imagined that a 27-year-old guy with oil-stained hands and worn-out boots would solve the problem in exactly 60 seconds. Tyler Reed had no fancy degrees or international certifications, lived in a cramped studio apartment in East LA, and earned barely $3,000 a month at a forgotten garage where he fixed Hondas and old Chevys. But that Saturday afternoon in June, when Victoria's red Ferrari stopped in front of his shop with smoke billowing from the hood, and the woman stepped out in Louboutin heels and Chanel sunglasses, screaming that someone needed to help her immediately, Tyler did something that would change both their lives forever. With a single gesture, with a movement so simple it seemed impossible, he solved what engineers from MIT couldn't figure out in 3 weeks, and that was only the beginning of a story neither of them would ever forget. If you're ready for this story, write in the comments where you're watching this video from. Reed & Sons Auto Repair hadn't existed for years, but the rusty sign still hung above the dented garage door on Imperial Highway in East LA, in that part of the city where tourists never ventured and where working-class families had built generations of honest but difficult lives. Tyler had grown up among those smells of gasoline and metal, son of a mechanic who had learned the trade from his grandfather, who had learned it from his great-grandfather. He was 27 years old, dark hair always messy from the habit of running his grease-stained hands through it, green eyes that sparkled with a practical intelligence no university could teach. He always wore the same blue coveralls with oil stains that wouldn't come out even after 100 washes. And his hands were constantly marked by small cuts and burns that told the story of a life spent under hoods and engines. His father had died 4 years ago, a sudden heart attack while fixing the mayor's car. Tyler had inherited the shop along with the debts, and since then he'd worked 16 hours a day to keep open a place that lost customers every month. The big chain service centers had conquered the market, and those who wanted their cars fixed went to modern facilities with air-conditioned waiting rooms and free coffee, not to a dusty hole where the only comfort was a plastic chair and a coffee machine that worked intermittently. But Tyler had a gift his father had recognized when he was only 7 years old and had fixed the broken toaster simply by listening to it. Tyler understood machines, not the way engineers understood them, with formulas and calculations. He understood them viscerally, almost as if he could feel what was wrong, as if engines spoke to him in a language only he knew. At 12, he had repaired a neighbor's tractor that 3 mechanics had declared beyond repair. At 17, he had gotten a 1962 Mustang running that had been sitting in a garage for 20 years. At 22, he had solved an electrical problem on a BMW that the official dealership couldn't diagnose for weeks. But none of these feats had brought him fame or fortune. They were just stories told around the neighborhood, urban legends about a kid who had magic hands but nothing else. His life was simple and predictable. He woke up at 6 in the morning in the studio apartment he rented above Mrs. Chen's grocery store, an 80-year-old widow who let him pay late when he couldn't make rent. He had breakfast with coffee and toast, opened the shop at 7, worked until 8 at night except Sundays. He ate pasta with sauce that he made on Sundays for the whole week. And in the evenings, he watched basketball games on a 15-year-old TV. He didn't have a girlfriend. He'd had one in high school, Sarah, but she'd gone to New York to study architecture and never came back. Sometimes he saw her photos on Instagram, trips to Paris, dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, boyfriends in designer jackets. It was a world so far from his that it seemed unreal, like watching a movie he wasn't part of. That Saturday in June had started like all the others. Tyler had fixed the mailman's scooter, changed oil on 3 Hondas, replaced brakes on a 2003 Corolla. It was late afternoon, and he was about to close when he heard a sound he'd never heard before on his street. A deep, powerful rumble, followed by a screech of brakes and then silence. He came out from under the garage door and saw something that seemed like a mirage. A flame-red Ferrari F8 Tributo, shiny as a mirror, stopped right in front of his shop. The hood was smoking slightly, and the engine was making an irregular ticking that made Tyler's skin crawl. Not a good kind of chill. The door opened, and out stepped a woman who looked like she'd walked out of a fashion magazine. Tall, slender, with perfectly straight blonde hair falling over her shoulders, she wore a tight white dress that probably cost more than Tyler earned in 6 months. The sunglasses she removed with a sharp gesture had the glittering Chanel logo, and the red high heels were clearly Louboutin, recognizable by the red sole that Tyler had only seen in rodeo drive shop windows. She was beautiful in a way that intimidated, in a way that clearly said she belonged to a different world, and the expression on her perfectly made-up face was one of pure irritation. She looked at the shop with barely disguised disgust, then stared at Tyler from head to toe with the same look reserved for something insignificant. And then she spoke, and her voice was sharp as broken glass. She said her Ferrari had broken down, that 100 mechanics over the past 3 weeks hadn't been able to figure out what was wrong, that she'd spent $30,000 on diagnostics and failed repair attempts at the official Ferrari shops in LA and Orange County. She said she was on her way to an important event and couldn't arrive in a taxi like a regular person. She said if this dump couldn't help her, she'd call a tow truck to take the car somewhere real professionals worked. Tyler said nothing. He listened to the engines ticking, observed the smoke coming from the hood, noticed a small detail in the hood's position that didn't seem perfectly aligned. Then he approached the Ferrari, placed a hand on the hot hood, and simply asked if he could take a look. The woman laughed, a sound without humor, and said he could do whatever he wanted as long as he got it running. Tyler opened the hood and looked inside. The V8 engine, with 700 horsepower, was a masterpiece of engineering, something he'd only seen in photographs. The 100 expert mechanics had checked everything: injectors, control unit, sensors, fuel pump, cooling system. They'd replaced parts, run computer diagnostics, consulted engineers in Germany. But none of them had noticed what Tyler saw in 5 seconds. A small cable, thin as fishing line, had come loose from its housing and was hanging free. It was hidden behind a cover, visible only from a certain angle, and didn't show up in any computer diagnostics because it didn't affect the main sensors. It only affected a secondary mechanism that regulated airflow under certain temperature conditions. Tyler reached his hand in, reattached the cable to its housing with a click, and told the woman to start the engine. She looked at him like he was crazy. He hadn't done anything, had just put his hands inside for a moment, but he insisted calmly, and she, with an exasperated sigh, got in the car and turned the key. The engine roared to life with a perfect rumble. No more ticking, no more smoke, just the pure, powerful sound of a perfectly healthy Ferrari V8. The silence that followed was absolute. The woman looked at the dashboard, then at Tyler, then back at the dashboard. She got out of the car with an expression oscillating between shock and disbelief. She asked what he'd done. Tyler explained in simple words, without using complicated technical terms. It was just a loose cable, hidden in a position that was hard to see. The expert mechanics had been looking for complex problems, sophisticated defects, electronic failures. No one had thought of something so simple. The woman remained silent for a long moment. Then she opened her Hermes bag and pulled out a leather wallet. She asked how much she owed. Tyler said $200. That's what he would charge for any quick intervention. The woman looked at him like he was an alien. She said she'd spent $30,000 in 3 weeks with the best mechanics in America, and he wanted $200 for solving the problem in 1 minute. Tyler didn't know what to say. That's what an intervention cost at his shop. The woman shook her head, pulled out a stack of bills, and gave him $500. She said if he'd asked for more, she would have respected him more, but he'd earned it anyway. Then, as she was getting back in the car, she stopped and looked at him with a different expression. As if for the first time, she was really seeing him, not just as a dirty mechanic in a shabby shop. She asked his name. He answered Tyler Reed. She said her name, Victoria Ashford. And she added something that seemed absurd to Tyler. She said she might need him again, and if he was interested, he could call her. She left a business card on the shop counter, got in the Ferrari, and drove off, leaving behind expensive perfume and the sound of the engine fading in the distance. Tyler looked at the card. There was just a name, Victoria Ashford, and a phone number. Nothing else. He put it in his coveralls pocket and went back to work, thinking he'd never see her again. He was wrong. 2 days later, the phone rang. Tyler didn't recognize the number, but answered anyway, wiping his hands on his coveralls. Victoria's voice was unmistakable. She asked if they could meet, said she had a proposal for him. Tyler, confused, accepted. She gave him an address in Beverly Hills, a restaurant he'd never heard of. She said she'd wait for him at 8 p.m. Tyler spent the rest of the day in a state of nervousness he couldn't explain. At 7:30, he closed the shop, went up to his apartment, and looked at his closet with despair. He had only 2 decent shirts, both old, and a pair of jeans without tears. He took a long shower, trying to get the stubborn dirt from under his nails, dressed in the least wrinkled shirt and best jeans. The restaurant was in Beverly Hills, surrounded by art galleries and designer boutiques. When Tyler arrived by bus and saw the elegant facade, he almost turned back. But Victoria had already seen him through the window and gestured for him to come in. She was even more beautiful than he remembered, in a tailored grey suit and hair pulled back in a sophisticated chignon. He immediately felt out of place, but she welcomed him with a smile that seemed genuine and invited him to sit. Victoria got straight to the point. She was the only daughter of Richard Ashford, founder of Ashford Enterprises, an empire spanning tech and real estate. Her father had died 6 months ago, leaving her $200 million, but with a cruel clause. She had to manage his collection of 30 vintage Ferraris for 1 year, or everything would go to a charitable foundation. It was her father's way of saying he never considered her good enough. Victoria understood business, but nothing about engines, and the expert mechanics she'd hired all seemed dishonest, ready to inflate invoices. Then she met Tyler, a guy who solved in 60 seconds what 100 experts hadn't understood, and who'd only asked $200. The proposal: become curator of the collection. $6,000 a month, free apartment, all necessary equipment. Tyler was shocked. It was double his current salary. The chance to work on vintage Ferraris. He asked why she'd choose him, a stranger. Victoria answered with sincerity. She was tired of people who lied for profit, who saw her only as a wallet. Tyler had treated her with simple respect, without trying to take advantage.
Tu aimes cette histoire, ma quoi? Laisse un petit like et abonne-toi à la chaîne. Maintenant, reprenons la vidéo.
Tyler thought about his father, the debts, the tiny apartment. He thought about the opportunity he'd always dreamed of. He accepted, not to become rich, but because it was the chance to finally do what he loved without the daily pressure of survival. Victoria smiled, and for the first time he saw something vulnerable behind the perfect mask. He could start the following week. The collection garage in Malibu took his breath away. 30 Ferraris displayed like jewels. A 1962 250 GTO worth $40 million alone. A 1987 F40. Models he'd only seen in books. But checking the engines, he discovered the previous mechanics had done superficial work. Wrong fluids, leaking gaskets, electrical problems hidden under shiny bodies. He started working dawn to dusk, checking every car millimeter by millimeter, ordering original parts from all over Europe. Victoria came almost daily, at first for oversight, then for something different. She'd sit and watch him work, ask questions, listen to his passionate explanations. Tyler discovered that behind the cold facade was a lonely woman, raised by a father who measured love in assets, but never said he was proud of her. Victoria confessed she hated those Ferraris because they represented what her father loved more than her. But listening to Tyler talk about them with genuine passion, she started to understand. One August afternoon, Victoria asked if he could teach her to drive the 250 GTO. Her father had never let her touch any collection car, said she wasn't capable. Tyler took the car to the private estate, where there was space to drive safely. The first attempts were disastrous. The engine stalled 3 times. But then Victoria got it. The gears shifted smoothly. The engine sang, the car glided. When she stopped, her eyes were shining. She got out laughing, a sound so genuine and free Tyler had never heard her make. In that moment, as the sun filtered through the trees, Tyler realized something had changed. He no longer saw her just as his employer. He saw her as Victoria, a woman reclaiming herself. And she looked at him like he really mattered, not just as a mechanic, but as a person. But neither said anything. Not yet. There were invisible barriers between them that seemed impossible to overcome. September brought the Pebble Beach concours, where the Ashford collection would be displayed for the first time. Victoria asked Tyler to accompany her as a guest, not a mechanic. She even bought him a tailored suit. When he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized himself, but the illusion lasted briefly. At the show, Tyler found himself surrounded by a world he didn't understand. Entrepreneurs, collectors, women covered in jewelry, wondering who this common-looking man was, next to Victoria Ashford. Then appeared Marcus Bennett, old suitor of Victoria's. When introduced to Tyler, he laughed, saying it was romantic to hire mechanics like gardeners. Tyler felt his blood boil. Victoria seemed uncomfortable but didn't defend him, and that hurt more than any insult. During the evening, Tyler saw her move through that world with ease. She belonged there among champagne and yacht conversations. He was just a mechanic who'd gotten lucky. Driving back to Malibu, the silence was heavy. Victoria apologized for Marcus, said he was part of a world she couldn't ignore. Tyler said he understood, but understanding didn't make the awareness of the gulf between them less painful. When they arrived at the garage, he got out without looking back. 3 days passed without Victoria coming. Tyler worked with fierce intensity, trying to smother his thoughts. He'd been an idiot to think there could be something between them, but on the 4th day, at sunset, Victoria appeared. Jeans, simple shirt, loose hair, no makeup. She sat on her usual stool and for a long moment said nothing. Then she confessed everything. She said she hated that fake world, that with Tyler she felt real for the first time. She said she was afraid, because everything had taught her people wanted her for money. But with him it was different. Tyler listened with his heart pounding. Then he said his truth. He didn't want her money or her world. He just wanted her, that woman who laughed driving a Ferrari, who sat in the dirty garage for hours, who looked at him like he really mattered. The silence was different this time, full of possibility. When Victoria approached, when he took her hand and she didn't pull away, when their eyes met, they both knew they were crossing a line they couldn't come back from. The kiss was sweet and desperate together. And in that moment, in the garage full of $1,000,000 Ferraris, with dirty hands and open hearts, Tyler and Victoria stopped worrying about different worlds and decided to build their own. The following months were the happiest. Tyler and Victoria kept their relationship private, but in their refuge, they built something real. Victoria learned to love cars as her own passion, not her father's obsession. But happiness was brief. One November morning, Tyler found 3 Ferraris sabotaged, contaminated brake fluid, cut cables, sand in engines. Professional work. The fired ex-mechanics were taking revenge. Evidence came quickly. Fingerprints, security video. They were arrested. But the damage was severe. The news leaked to press. Tabloids attacked. Heiress unable to protect father's legacy. Marcus Bennett and other rivals used the scandal against her. For the first time, Tyler saw Victoria break down. She said maybe they were right, that she wasn't good enough. Tyler held her close and said her father included that clause not because he thought she wasn't worthy, but because he wanted her to find her own path. And she had. Tyler swore to repair everything before the deadline. For 2 months, he lived in the garage, working day and night. Victoria stayed by his side, learning, helping. 1 month before the deadline, all 3 Ferraris were perfect. But the real surprise came after. Victoria called a press conference in the garage. In front of journalists and partners, she told the whole story. The sabotage, the repairs, and especially Tyler. She said he'd solved in 1 minute what 100 experts couldn't understand. She said he'd saved the collection with pure talent, and she said in front of everyone that Tyler wasn't just the collection curator, but the man she loved. A journalist asked for confirmation. Victoria answered, looking at Tyler. I confirm a relationship with the most honest, talented, and courageous man I've ever known. And if anyone has a problem with that, I frankly don't care. Half the media criticized them, the other half celebrated them. But they didn't care. They'd overcome sabotage, judgments, doubts. They'd chosen each other, despite everything. 1 year after Richard Ashford's death, Victoria presented complete documentation to the executor. Every Ferrari was in perfect condition, some even improved. Independent appraisals confirmed the collection had been managed with exceptional competence. The clause was fulfilled, even exceeded. Victoria had won. The empire was officially hers, with no more conditions, but professional success paled compared to what she'd gained personally. Tyler was no longer just the collection curator. He was her partner in everything, in life and business decisions. Victoria had brought him formally into the company as technical consultant, and to his great surprise, Tyler had ideas beyond engines. He proposed opening a vintage car restoration school where kids like him, without means but with talent, could learn a trade. Victoria loved the idea, and together they founded the Ashford Academy, based in Malibu. They hired retired master craftsmen, bought cars to restore, offered full scholarships. The first class of 10 students started in March. Some came from working families like Tyler, others from foster homes, still others from youth recovery centers. Tyler taught personally, and watching them work on engines with eyes shining with the same passion he'd always had, he felt he was doing something important. The old Reed & Sons shop also found new life. Tyler didn't sell it, but transformed it into a community garage, where repairs cost little, and where he hired young mechanics, giving them a chance. It was his way of honoring his father's memory. Victoria, for her part, discovered she really loved business when she did it her way. Without pressure to prove anything to her father, without having to conform to expectations of men in suits who underestimated her, she started investing in ethical, sustainable projects that had real community impact. The Ashford empire began to change, becoming an example of responsible business, and personally, she and Tyler built a life that resembled neither the world she came from nor the one he came from. It was something new, theirs. They got married one June morning, 2 years after their first meeting, in a tiny ceremony in the Malibu Estate Park. They were only real friends. Mrs. Chen, who cried through the whole ceremony, the Academy's first students, some workers from the old shop, a few childhood friends of both. No journalists, no business partners, just people who truly loved them. Victoria wore a simple ivory dress, Tyler a dark blue suit. They exchanged simple rings and promises that spoke of respect, support, and genuine love. And when they kissed under the century-old trees with the Ferrari garage just meters away, it all seemed to make sense. 3 years after the wedding, their daughter was born. They named her Grace because she had brought grace into their lives from the first moment. One Sunday afternoon, when Grace was 2 years old, Tyler brought her to the garage. The little girl ran among the Ferraris laughing, and Victoria watched her with a smile that said everything. Tyler put his arm around her shoulders, and she rested her head on his shoulder. They looked at the collection that had brought them together, thinking about the improbable journey that had led them there. A poor mechanic and a rich heiress, two worlds that should never have met. Yet they had, and from that chance encounter, from that 1 minute that changed everything, was born not just a love story, but an entire life. Tyler sometimes wondered what would have happened if he hadn't opened the shop that Saturday in June, if Victoria had chosen another road when the Ferrari broke down. But then he looked at his wife, his daughter, the life they'd built together, and understood that certain things were meant to happen. Not by magic, not by blind luck, but because sometimes in this world, two people find each other at the right moment, recognize each other for what they truly are beyond appearances, and have the courage to fight for something real. The red Ferrari that brought them together was still there, shiny and perfect. But it was no longer just an expensive car. It was a symbol, a reminder of when a simple gesture, reattaching a cable in 60 seconds, had proven that a person's value isn't measured in degrees or wealth, but in honesty, passion, and quiet competence. And as Grace laughed running among those beautiful machines, Tyler and Victoria knew they'd given their daughter something money couldn't buy, a family built on true love. And the lesson that in this world, when you do the right thing with a clean heart, sometimes miracles really do happen. If this story made you believe that true love exists beyond social barriers, leave a little heart down below so I know. And if you really want to support stories like this, that talk about real people with real hearts in a world that often forgets what truly matters, you can leave a "thanks so much" through the Super Thanks feature below. Every gesture counts, just like that 1 minute Tyler spent fixing that Ferrari without expecting anything in return, because you chose to stay until the end, and that makes you as special as the protagonists of this story.